thanks everybody, and thanks Scott and Jan. As you say, a really, really complex topic. And when we start sort of talking about ethics and hate speech, I suppose that the really big question for me is whose ethics, whose rights, who sets that code, and who takes the moral high ground in all of this. So there's and what happens when we make those big decisions? If we manage to silence people, who are we silencing and how does that come out? So I think we were all really surprised by the whole Brexit and Trump stuff, but I think wherever we silence something, there is something underneath that comes out. So I think there's very big questions to be asked when we ask about ethics in online media. And how do we work within that complexity? So I'm just going to speak about the No Hate Speech movement and our role in it, where it's come from, and explain how we've gone through some of those complexities. We don't have the answers, but the challenges that we've met along the way. Certainly, I think if I knew of all of the challenges we were going to meet along the way, I might have said, whoa, can we take this on? The No Hate Speech movement in Ireland operates without any money, absolutely no money, completely with volunteers, and just a tiny bit of my time in terms of coordinating it from the National Youth Council. So it doesn't have a huge, backup behind it. It does, however, have the Council of Europe that set it up. So I think it might be good to go back into why did the Council of Europe take on a topic like this in the first place? And it all started really back in 2011 with the shooting of 77 people by Anders Breivik. And a group of Norwegian young people were in the Council of Europe, in the youth department, talking about future campaigns. And they said, how do we stop something so awful from happening ever again? And they looked at the whole history of what he'd been doing and noted the amount of hate speech online, how much there was sharing and production of hate speech that would lead to somebody doing something as horrendous as that. And they said, we really need to do something about this, and persuaded the Council of Europe to take on board to do a campaign against hate speech online. And that was set up by 2013. So what they did at that stage was they went out to all of their members, their 49 countries, and said, will you take this on? And 39 countries of their members took on the call and said, yes, we're going to do something about this. So it was very much, how does the thingy work? Is it here? Okay. So very much the whole thing is that it's a youth initiative. And it was going to be young people fighting against hate speech. And a real key sort of piece is around raising awareness around hate speech and reducing the acceptance of it. So very much a cultural shift was what they were looking at. And there was a whole range of things that they were going to do in terms of how that they would operate the campaign. So I'm just going to talk about a few of those and some of the challenges that came along with it. Just to say also that although initially the campaign was going to run from 2013 to 2015, by the time 2015 came around, there were a number of terrorist attacks that were happening across Europe, and the governments within Europe said to the Council of Europe, please continue this on. And I think the governments were very much thinking, we need to fight the hate speech that is driving terrorists to fight against Western values. And I think our take on that was not that was our concern. Our concern was about the rise of Islamophobia that was leading to, and particularly the impact on young people. So sometimes you can have governments and civil society very much at odds with that, and young people really wanting to come back at the rise of Islamophobia that was happening. So So just to say some very key things that we looked at in terms of the campaign. And I'm just going to talk about three major initiatives and how they presented challenges along the way. So the first initiative was that there would be a hate speech monitoring. So they would have a hate speech watch, and it was set up on the website in the Council of Europe. And they wanted people to feed in examples and evidence of hate speech that was happening. Supposed to get a body of evidence to say, this is what we're seeing. A huge challenge with that is the fact that this is a young person's campaign, particularly in Ireland. When we talk about young people in Ireland, we talk about the ages from 10 to 25. That's the age we work with. In Europe, especially with the Council of Europe, that can go up to 35. And one of the things that we didn't want to do, and I guess that's probably happened in other countries, is we didn't want to say to young people, go out there and find the hate speech and stick it up in the hate speech watch, because it's pretty awful stuff. And we weren't in a space where we could support people around the awful things that they would have to be looking at. So that aspect of the campaign, I think, has not been very successful in terms of just it's a real challenge to go into that space, particularly a hard challenge for young people. So that was definitely one of the key things. And then, but a lot of the focus then was on, okay, what's the work that we can do around the campaign? And there was a really strong piece saying, well, we need to think about counter-speech. We need to upskill young people to be able to answer back to the things that they're hearing and seeing online. Do we have an argument that can come back? Now that takes a very, very high skill level and a really strong knowledge base, because hate speech can come from anywhere and on any topic, and no person anywhere is going to necessarily have those arguments to be able to answer back. So that was a really difficult thing. And if we asked people to do the counter speech, there was a real fear that you'd end up doing the whole countering the more obvious and countering the trolls, trying to deal with that. But that was never going to change mindsets. The trolls were not the place where you were going to be able to make a difference. The real difference was going to happen with the people who might be influenced by those. So where people put their attentions was really important. So, and the other thing about the counter-speech work is, if you see something online that you think is awful and you're passionate and you want to do something around social justice and you want to do something to cut people down or to stop them from thinking the way they are, it's very easy to retaliate with your own rants, and it can degenerate quite quickly. So it's not an easy space to sort of ask people to be in, or for young people to take on. Another challenge, and Scott pointed this out really clearly, was the whole thing around the definition of hate speech. It's a really, really difficult place in which to actually have, a definition. We do have a working definition. As I say, that was. Oops. Okay. So the working definition that we have is around hate speech and covering all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or attempt to justify any form of hatred or discrimination based on intolerance. And that includes, but is not limited to, intolerance of people and several groups: gender identity, sexual orientation, religious, cultural, ethnic background, disability, health. There was a whole range of things. Now this is something that, this isn't the Council of Europe definition. And the reason it isn't the Council of Europe definition is things get marred up with all sorts of politics and bureaucratic stuff and all the rest. The Council of Europe definition is very much grounded on the whole religious, cultural, ethnic background, and other groups. Whereas we felt in Ireland that it was really important that those groups were seen equally. But things take a long time to come around, and also in Europe there are, again, another challenge, huge difficulties around, in some countries, about including certain groups. So in some countries LGBT groups aren't included in the national campaigns. In other countries, Roma mightn't be included. So often you can have politics playing out there and question marks over the whole human rights sort of piece. But and when it comes to definitions, again, I don't know if this will go backwards. No. That whole thing of how do you define hate speech in a very practical sense? So people will use images that aren't exactly the swastika, but you know what they're trying to say. They'll say things where the words themselves don't pick up on any sort of hate words. So you're having to read through things and understand things. And tone doesn't come across in social media. So it can be really difficult to actually know what that is and define it. And then when you see something online, to be able to extract out of it whether or not it's hate speech. So that's always a difficult challenge. The other thing that's really difficult about this campaign is we actually never know what our influence is, because when you're going out there on a social media platform and you're trying to do a piece of work, you only know what your own reach is. So we can look at our own social media reach. But the whole campaign is supposed to work on the whole principle of the ripple effect. So we don't know how other people are influencing, other people in their circles. So it's not an easy campaign to be able to say even what influence have we had or do we have. We know we're brought into Twitter conversations quite often. So we do have a sense that people want us to be there, but it is very hard to know what we're doing. Another sort of ethical question that we've had, and again comes down to that understanding around hate speech. If we develop an understanding, how then do we pass it on? And one of the ways of passing on our understanding as we develop it around hate speech is to show examples of it. But we have taken a decision that we are not going to show examples of hate speech. And I know social media companies, some of them have said it all depends on the context. So I know for Google on their YouTube platform, they'll say, well, if the context is all right, then we'll show it. We took that ethical stance here in Ireland of saying, actually, if we show the hate speech, it's just resharing it. So then you're always talking about the elephant in the room in some way. So you don't have that tangible piece to look at in front of you to say, this is what we're talking about, or educating other people online about what it is. So the third initiative that the campaign has been really strong about, and probably the most effective, is the whole area of counter-narratives. And that's trying to put all of our energies into finding ways to counter the fake news, to counter the stuff that gets sent across social media that just is wrong, is not telling the full story. The big question there is, where do you get that? How do you develop it? And so it's not that easy, but a lot of the work has been where young people are doing really creative stuff and just trying to shift mindsets. That there's a really strong sense around, if we just send opposite messages, if we really push the human rights message, if we really focus very much on media literacy, that will do the job that we're looking to do. So that's been a lot of the focus in the more recent times around the No Hate Speech movement, which means it's not that cutting edge, hard hitting. It's a much more softer approach. And there can be challenges with that, because when you have a softer approach, sometimes it can be too soft. Sometimes it's just too weak. So there'll be things like saying we need to have photo shoots out there. And way better to have a picture like that than having a group of people standing there saying they're at an event. We're saying to people there's ways of doing, there's ways of maybe getting attention. But it's a tiny bit of attention, tiny bit really. And asking people to put photos together, yes, there's going to be the work that happens offline and doing that. But we're not talking about, making major impact, but maybe making small progressive impacts along the way. So it means being there for the long haul. And of course, we don't have any money or any resources to be there for the long haul. Then the other biggest challenge really that I think when it comes to the whole area of campaigning online is the whole nature of how we are online. And I don't think we are any different online to the way we are offline in the way we gather our circle of influence. So we will all have our own bubbles and groups. We'll have our own friends. So if we share stuff, we're sharing amongst our own friends. So they can often be quite separate to one another because people want to hear things that validate what they already think. So if we end up with sort of very separate things going on in those separate bubbles, you get this really strong human rights stuff going on in one bubble, but you get this awful turbulence of hate going on in another bubble, and you're not necessarily able to get across to those other people to be able to convince them otherwise or to tell them other ways of being. So I think there is something about how do we manage campaigning that's actually going to reach across to other groups and make an impact, like a real impact, the sort of impact that changes the Andrei Breiviks of this world. So that challenge is there. There's also, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have in Europe when we're doing this campaign is we're dealing with so many languages. So if I develop a great counter-narrative piece in Germany and it's in German, we're not going to be able to use it in Ireland without doing a translation, and we don't have the resources to do a translation. So it's not as if you've got all of Europe being able to produce counter-narratives and being able to share them across with one another. Each country has to sort of do its own, so that can be a difficult piece as well in just trying to build a sort of a whole body of work that might be able to be used as a counter-narrative. The other thing that's actually quite difficult in terms of the campaign is, there's my languages, is actually I'll show you what this is like. Yeah. So the campaign pages, so this is the Irish Campaign Facebook page. It will look pretty identical to the Council of Europe one because they're all modelled off the same piece. So when we say to the young people, the platform is yours, put up whatever you feel you need to put up on it, they'll come back and they'll say, yeah, but it's the Council of Europe and it's NYCI, and actually we're just not absolutely sure what we should put up in that, because there's a lot of layers there. And I'm thinking, can we speak for things in the Council of Europe? Can we speak for NYCI? So there's a little bit of trepidation there in terms of the young people taking ownership of it as much as we would want them to. So even though we've got a lot of stuff going on, we've got the Facebook, we've got Twitter, we've got a website, we've got all of that out there, and it's active, and we keep it as active as possible. There's still a little bit of confidence building that needs to happen with young people. And then probably one of the biggest ethical challenges that we have faced and have had is very much around coming back to the rights and what is it that we do. So the biggest strength, the absolute biggest strength of our campaign is that it's about building solidarity. So you have young people from the LGBT community fighting against racism. You have young people from minority ethnic community fighting against disableism, fighting against sexism. There's this huge strength in the solidarity that the campaign builds up. When you're talking about solidarity and when you're talking about lots of groups of people, you have to weigh up the rights of different groups of people. So what happens then when you've got rights that might counteract against one another? And that becomes a much more difficult space. So in particular, just to give probably one of the better examples, though it comes up in lots of situations, but particularly around the marriage equality debate. So we would have had a number of very passionate young people who were very involved in the no hate speech movement. And we're saying to them, well, what do we do here? What happens when you're talking about fighting for rights, for marriage equality, and you've also got people who are fighting for their right to say that their religious belief does not allow them to support gay marriage? And how do you marry that up? How do you manage it? So we had to decide as a campaign that we had to go with one very strong message, and our really strong message is we cannot side with any particular side. We can't take sides, that everybody needs to have their voice. The only side that we can take is to say that if you are going to have any discussion at all, it's got to be respectful. So that's our key message, as being we need respectful debate, and that's been our ethical code. And the whole way through the marriage equality, we couldn't say vote yes. We couldn't put up articles that said vote yes. We could put up articles where they were discussing it, where you knew what side somebody might be on, but we couldn't actually say this is the way that you should vote. We had to say, please, 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 whatever you do, please put your opinions forward, but put them forward with respect. And that's been our sort of harder ethical place. Very hard for the young people, really hard. When you're really passionate about something, that was a really hard thing for them to take on at times. So yeah, that's the campaign. And if I had my time starting again on the campaign, I think one of the places that I would be putting a lot more of my energies into would be around the online journalist pieces and the comment sections, because I think that's where you might be able to reach across those bubbles in many ways. That's me.
Okay.
Okay.